Alright, new DMs, there's some considerations to make when building your first dungeon. The first of which is the basic philosophy behind the dungeon, or really any kind of obstacle. The party should have a goal, and any obstacles should be obstacles to slow them down, and then they can overcome them and feel good and reach their goal. But there has to be stakes for this to be meaningful. So when you design your dungeon, think of it like that. Now, I like to go with 25 men in the dungeon, 8 rooms, and then, of course, I gave you my rule of thumb on balance a little while ago, but you've got someone with double stats of the player, that's a super player. You got someone with stats of the optimized player, that's a player plus, and if you got someone with stats of half the player, that is a half player, which is 4 points for the super player, 2 points for the player plus, and 1 point for the half player, right? So that's how you should think of the monsters. Just a quick rule of thumb in terms of balance for them. And when you make your rooms, of course, have no less than 8 or no more than 8 monsters per room. But really, the most important part is having a dynamic dungeon, because what that means is the dungeon isn't just static, right? It's not unchanging. So if you have the Goblin Cave that they decide to stake out for a while, like, oh yeah, we think they're here, well, don't just have the cave there for several hours, don't have nothing happen. Instead, have a patrol happen. You got to think about what the goals of the monsters are. You got to think about what the monsters want to really do this properly, right? So let's take the Cragmaw goblins, for example. What do they want? They want to waylay travelers, they want to gain loot, they want that sort of thing. So naturally, they would be sending out looters, wouldn't they? They would be checking up on the people they sent to ambush, wouldn't they? So that makes it a lot easier in determining what events occur outside of the dungeon as time passes. Right? Maybe you see someone bringing in maybe you see some goblins bringing in wolves, maybe you see some goblin foragers returning, anything like that. Maybe there were other ambush sites and they got someone else and that ambush is being brought back and the player's going to encounter some of those goblins, right? So when you know what the monsters want and how they would behave, it becomes so much easier to make these kinds of encounters. And this is the kind of thing you're going to have to improv. So again, knowing your monster stats, knowing their behaviors and their goals, that makes it so much easier. And it's not that hard, to put one of these together. Like 4 goblins, 3 goblins and a wolf, anything like that. It's really not that hard. But the toughest part would be getting the balance on the fly. And again, you just want to at least match the party in terms of numbers. I never want my monsters outnumbered because that's going to be a really weak encounter for the players. Now maybe you do want a weaker encounter. Maybe one of the goblins was killed at a secondary ambush site. It's all these kind of decisions that you can make. But those are some of the things you should consider when making your dungeon dynamic. Now in the same sense, your combats should be dynamic. And again, dynamic means not static. Static means unchanging. So something changes every round of combat. So for the goblins, shoot their bow, shoot their bow, shoot their bow, shoot their bow. Oh, all the goblins are dead, right? Is that as fun as the goblins shoot their bow and then they run for cover and then they release some wolves and then they call for allies and then they make a run for it and then they leave a trap as they're running, right? That's a lot more fun than just the goblins shooting a bow. And that's what a dynamic combat is, right? So beyond mere monster encounters, you should have some puzzles, you should have some traps, some riddles, something like that. Now, of course, not every dungeon would have that, but maybe just some sort of mental obstacle, some sort of non-combat obstacle, like a trap. It counts as, in my eyes, as a non-combat obstacle. So let's take the Cragmaw goblins again, for example. Sorry about that yawning. So let's take the Cragmaw goblins, for example, right? They have the bridge, which releases a flood. And so the players have to be smart enough to avoid detection so that they don't get washed out. And, they can see evidence, and I would play up evidence of the stream bed that is now dry as the goblins have dammed the river, right? Because it's much stronger when it's undammed, but now that it is, there's very little water flow, so they'll be able to see the weak trickle of water, and that's a way you can foreshadow the traps, and that's going to lead to a feel-good moment rather than players just being bamboozled by something they had no way of predicting. That's a really nice addition to the module that's not there. If you add that in, just mentioning the dried riverbed, because I don't know if it's stated that there's one there, but obviously there is if there's a stream within the cave. So yes, traps. I struggled with traps for a long time until I thought of them like one-time use monsters. right? So basically a trap just has a DC to notice it, a DC to beat it, right? So the DC to notice it, you can think of that like armor class, right? Because if they don't make the armor class, then nothing even happens at all and they just fail. So if they don't even notice the trap, then they will spring it, right? So you can think of the chance to notice as armor class, and then once the trap has been sprung, that's like the chance to hit. And if they don't detect it, maybe give them disadvantage on the trap, something like that, right? And you can think of the trap's effects, the trap's triggering, as an attack roll or a saving throw for the party, however you prefer to look at it when you set the DC. And that's a nice way to think about it. And then, of course, whatever effects happen. So if you wanted to... I'm so sorry about that. If you want it to just deal a little bit of damage, if you want to think of it, because I think honestly the best way to look at traps is like a monster. So maybe it just takes out one player, maybe it temporarily takes out a player and makes the combat that ensues harder because maybe it's a triggered or maybe it's an alarm trap. So once they set it off, the goblins know and they start coming. So now that one player is restrained by this rubble or he's caught in a bear trap or whatever, it's now that the instead of just the party having all the time in the world to get them out, raise the stakes, make the game a little more tense, and have the goblins come to deal with the intruders, which I think is a nice way to play that. And it's a little bit of a high tier tip, but I'm sure you can do it, right? And so now puzzles. I think some people have said riddles are not puzzles, but I disagree. It's just the same as a mental puzzle. You just have to come up with what the answer is. So I think riddles are just a kind of puzzle, like anything else. You just have to give them the right answer and you will be granted access. So my advice for new DMs on puzzles would be to steal them from modules, steal them from other people. I think modules are one of the better sources to steal them from, although they are quite costly. So modules, take them from other people, ask DMs about puzzles. I'm sure you could get a book of puzzles from a third-party source for not too much. And then of course, once you come up yourself, I would take these and I would reuse them till you kind of fine-tuned and understood puzzles and riddles, because it gets easier with time, but it's very difficult at the beginning. At least for me it was. So that would be my advice for new DMs on the first dungeon, right? 25 men, 8 rooms, throw in some puzzles, make sure everything is very dynamic. Approach it before I leave. If it's a chore, it's a bore, right? If they ever feel like they're just slogging through something, if they feel like they're just rolling dice for combat after combat, if it gets to the point where they feel like it's a chore to do it, then it's going to be boring for them. And if it's boring for them, it's probably not going to be too much fun for you. So yeah, goodbye, good luck, and have fun in your games.